You are listening to MCC GeoPod, the geopolitical podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
Today's GeoPod's guest is Professor Jeffrey Kaplan, is the author or editor of 30 books and over 100 articles and anthology chapters of religious violence, millenarianism, history, terrorism, and reconciliation. His most recent book is The Birth Pangs of Gush Emunim, which will be published by Routledge in 2024. Other recent books are Anti-Semitism in Hungary, Appearance and Reality, The Legacy of 9/11, Transformations of Policing, Intelligence and Counterterrorism, and Apocalypse, Revolution and Terrorism. He has also published the career retrospective Radical Religion and Violence, Theory and Case Studies as the first volume in the Routledge Distinguished Author series. His articles cover such topics as terrorism and religious violence, radicalization and de-radicalization, intelligence and national security, and Cold War studies. He is currently the Senior Distinguished Fellow at the Danube Institute in Budapest, Hungary, and an external expert with the Islamic Cultural, Educational, and Scientific Organization in Rabat, Morocco. Today, in our discussion, we will focus on terrorism and the Gaza War. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Nowadays, terrorism has become a common term, and mass media and experts uses it, but their definition has altered. How should we define modern terrorism? What are the common terms and typical characteristics?
It is the hardest question in terrorism because nobody has come up with a definition that everybody agrees to. I have a friend who's a very close colleague, Alex Schmidt, who is in England, great expert on this. And he published a book called Terrorism. It's the ultimate book for students of terrorism. It's where you start. Very first book. His first edition had a chapter on definitions of terrorism. It was 200 pages for the chapter alone. So that is a problem. When I'm teaching terrorism, I say something very simple. Terrorism is always oppositional. Terrorism is the weak against the strong. And terrorism is a tactic, not a strategy. So it's a way to create a message that the world will hear, and a message that is tailored to specific audiences. But it never wins. There's no hope that terrorism by itself will overthrow a state, for example. It's simply a tactic.
And what are the characteristics of terrorist tactics, the common characteristics?
It's changed over time. In David Rappaport, who is a great scholar of terrorism, came up with a theory of 4 waves, which I think explains terrorism very well. And in the first wave, which was the anarchist wave, the characteristics of terrorism were big explosions and assassinations. That's what they did. After that, we had other waves. There was the wave of national liberation, which was attacks on colonial authorities. The third wave, the leftist wave, which I remember very well from the 1960s, because then terrorism was theater. The idea is you do something that would catch the media's attention, something like, plane hijacking was the best, but you weren't supposed to hurt anybody at the same time. And so it was something that was made for TV. Fourth wave, what that we're in now, the religious wave, the signature tactic is atrocity. As many casualties as you can create, that is your statement. And so it's changed considerably.
So does it mean that by nowadays terrorism got a character which needs publicity with the effect to create fear?
Exactly. That's exactly it. It's publicity to create fear, and the canvas now that you ride on are the bodies of your victims. But they're not the audience. The audience are people who can make decisions. The audience are states, and the atrocities you create, the violence you create, is simply theater.
And there are also some sources who started to mention or to separate different characteristics or types of terrorism. And for example, and today we talk about mostly Islamic terrorism, right? When did Islamic terrorism really appear in the history, and how did it evolve?
In its modern form, it appeared in the 1920s with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which began in 1929. And they started with terrorism. They went through other cycles as well, as being parliamentary, of being a service organization, back to terrorism. But that's where it began. And it changed character after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when it became a global phenomenon and something that didn't just involve Muslims. It was Islamic terrorism, certainly. But at the same time, you saw Christians, you saw Jews, who also were doing terrorism, or acts of terrorism for religious purposes. But it's after the Iranian Revolution, Islamic terrorism became associated in everybody's mind with terrorism.
What were the common elements of this Islamic terrorism, for example, in the name of Allah, or did they have any other objectives?
No, it goes much deeper than that, and I don't want to really create a lesson here because it would take us forever. But there are a couple of common elements. One, I have to use two Arabic words. One is Ishad, which means interpretation of sacred text, not by what it says, but by what you infer are the underlying meanings. So you look at the Quran and it says one thing, for example, which can be peaceful, but then those who claim to be able to do this, which are very few, it's forbidden in Islam, in Sunni Islam, to do this. You look at what you consider to be the underlying meanings, and then you're fighting in the name of Allah. You're fighting in the name of religion and doing things that religion does not sanction, which is exactly what we saw with the Hamas attack. There's nothing in there about rape, there's nothing in there about kidnapping, and there's nothing in there about burning people alive. But in that interpretation, it's done. And the other word is takfir. And this is the one that the Western world really doesn't understand at all. Takfir means I, as a Muslim, if I were doing this as a Muslim, I say I can judge whether you're a good Muslim or not. And then I will give you one warning, and if you don't follow the path that I think is right, we will expel you from the Islamic world and kill you. So it's something that's internal. It's aimed at other Muslims. It's not aimed at the Western world. And so we don't see it in the West very much. But it's much more prevalent than attacks on the West in many ways. It's attacks on their own cultures and countries.
Hamas roots goes back to Islamic Brotherhood as well.
Yes.
Right? And as far as I know, you lived in Palestine. Could you tell us a little bit more about your experience during that time where you were working there?
It was an interesting time. I went back actually over Christmas and was very moved to see that not only was I remembered after 40 years, almost 30-some years, but my name was on the wall of the institution where I taught. And the reason it was there is I was there during the First Intifada and stayed there through the whole uprising. And so all of those who were survivors of that conflict are memorialized on that wall. So I was very moved by it, but it was at the time of the First Intifada. And so this was about 86, 87, 88.
And as an experience, how did you remember on the Intifada? What was the roots? How was the society during this uprising against oppression?
It's interesting because there were two waves, and now there's about to be a third wave of Intifada, and each one was different. When I was there, it was a more or less spontaneous uprising, and it mainly involved the youth. There was a great poem called "Children of the Stones," which is very famous in the Islamic world. And it was about the young people who threw rocks at Israelis, who then shot at them, sometimes with rubber bullets, sometimes not. And so it was an increasingly violent time. And where I was living in Hebron, this is the epicenter of the battle because it's the main area where the Israeli settlers, who are a very radical group of religious Zionists, live. And so the situation was very tense and very violent before the Intifada, much worse after.
What was the main cause of their...
It was very difficult to live under occupation. Let me give you an anecdote to give you an idea of how difficult it is. And when I say this, this is not to excuse what happened with Hamas and that attack. It was incomprehensible, and it was terrorism in its rawest form. But at the same time, I was back during Christmas, and so with one of my old colleagues, and we were in the Medina, the central area of Hebron, which was settlers have taken over most of it. There are Israeli soldiers who control every bit of it. You can go to the masjid, to the mosque, to pray and back. But that's about it. And he was saying that his father is buried in a cemetery there, but he can't get to it because of the Israeli blockade. Well, it's only 500 meters from where we were standing. And he'd never been able to see his father's grave. So we went to the Israeli soldiers, and I got them talking, and we had a very good conversation, mainly about football, actually. And while we were engaged, I was waving at him like this, go, 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 go. And so for the first time in 30 years, he was able to see the grave of his father. It's that difficult to live there. I mean, imagine that. You can't walk 500 meters to attend the graves of your family.
And at that time, from Israeli parts, as you mentioned, so they had strict rules how to rule the Gazan area. Did they anytime ease these rules or give any opportunities for the Palestinians to agree on these questions?
Let me go back a bit to make this clear for your listeners, because when we're talking about Gaza and when we're talking about the West Bank, we're talking about two different animals. Gaza is ruled by Hamas, which were democratically elected. The West Bank is ruled by Fatah, which also was democratically elected. Neither government is popular, to put it mildly, but the two groups are very opposed. So what happened in Gaza and what happened in the West Bank are two different things. In Gaza, for the last now 16 years, Israel has had an embargo on it. It is riven by poverty, drugs, and crime. It's a hopeless place. And the Israelis are somewhat responsible for it. The Gazans are somewhat responsible for it. Hamas is somewhat responsible for it. But it's a terrible situation and much worse than in the West Bank. So the situation in Gaza was terrible. In the West Bank, the leader of, one of the Shin Bet commander, Shin Bet is the Israeli Secret Service, in the conflict about the judicial reform in Israel, he said, look, I've got to tell you the truth. We have created apartheid there. And this is not said by the outside. This is said by one of the guys who were responsible for enforcing it. And the situation still is much better than it was in Gaza. Gaza is a hopeless case. And so the idea of an uprising there was almost impossible. They don't have the means. So the attack on Israel, in some ways, had a logic to it, but not on Israeli civilians like that. The Israelis, whatever they've done, have done nothing like what happened with the Hamas attack.
Let's talk about a little bit about Hamas.
Sure.
So they took control on Gaza since 2006.
Yes.
What they promised for the Palestinians when they were elected.
There was the public promise, and there was what everybody knew. The private promise is, we will do better than Fatah. We will not govern because we're Muslim, because we are Salafi, which is very religious. We will not have the kind of corruption that is so endemic under Fatah that it's become a public joke. Nepotism, we will not appoint only our relatives to important positions. And we will not have unfair taxation. We will not have license fees for businesses that are ruinous, and we put it in our pockets. That's what they promised privately.
And what did they keep from these promises?
Very little. The truth is, very little. And the excuse was, though, that the Israelis have blockaded us, we're in poverty, and we don't have resources.
So they are just pointing only on the Israelis for the inner problems.
Only on the Israelis, but also on Fatah.
As far as I know, the major problem for Palestinian people in Gaza is that they have a very high number of unemployment. They are dependent on humanitarian assistance. They also have lack of resources like clean water, energy, and so on. From your point of view, how could this problem be resolved in any time with the assistance of international community? Because as far as we see now, the Hamas ruled Gaza and the Israeli government couldn't reach an agreement since decades.
If you had asked me that last month, I would have given you one answer. Today, there is no hope. I mean, Israel is the air offensive and the ground offensive are such that they've destroyed so much. And for the listeners, I don't want, I'm answering the questions, but I don't want to, I know that it kind of sounds like I'm an advocate only for the Palestinians. And it's really not. There are two sides to the story here. But the question on Gaza itself, Terrorism 101, the very first thing I teach my students. In every aspect of terrorism, the one thing terrorists want is for a government to overreact. Because that forces the common people who are watching this like they're watching a football game on television to make a choice. You choose the government or you choose us, but you can't stand on the sidelines. And when the government overreacts, when there are what we would euphemistically say are collateral casualties, but actually are civilian and child deaths on the grand scale, that is exactly what Hamas wants. Because not only is this impacting on Gaza, which is essentially lost. It will be destroyed by the time all this is done, and then Europe is going to have a refugee crisis bigger than 2015. But that's another question. But in the wider Islamic world, the people and governments had become very, very tired of the Palestinian question, and very few talked about it anymore. And I could give you a whole history of that from when I first went to the region to live there, and that was in the 70s. To today, there's been a whole evolution from extreme pro-Palestinian to saying, A, they can't get along with each other. B, they can't organize themselves. I'm watching my language because it is a public thing here. And third, if we wanted to have our liberation, we being Saudis, Syrians, Egyptians, whoever it happens to be talking, we would have taken it by now. And they were hopeless. But with the scale of what's happening in Gaza, there is a radicalization throughout the Islamic world that are supportive of Hamas. Not because they like Hamas, but because Israel overreacted on such a grand scale.
Was it at the beginning of October a surprise for Israel? Because from the scenes we could see that it was a surprise. But
Yes.
how could it happen? I mean, how could the Hamas surprise that much?
That's what Israelis are asking. And in 1973, there was an intelligence failure which allowed the Egyptians to cross the Sinai. And it was considered the greatest intelligence failure in Israeli history. But that intelligence failure resulted in huge tank battles in the Sinai, away from population centers. This one, which is just almost incomprehensible given between the Israeli intelligence and military capabilities plus the United States cooperation. It's almost unbelievable that this could happen, that they could penetrate, not only do it, plan it, penetrate that deeply into Israel, and then return with hostages. I mean, it's incredible, and Israelis are asking that question.
Can we call this action the Third Intifada, or
No.
it is something else?
No, it is not an intifada. An intifada means the translation from Arabic is like shaking off, like a dog shaking off fleas, kind of thing is the where the word comes from, the imagery of it. And it is an uprising. This is not an uprising. This is a terrorist attack. And it's something completely different.
And you mentioned the Arabic states and the reaction of Hamas attack.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think in the long term? Can it cause again a new Arab-Israeli war, or at least a coalition against Israel again?
In a very worst case scenario, Israel in the short term has two issues. One is Hezbollah on the Lebanese border. Hezbollah is a state within a state. It has a conventional military that defeated the Israeli military in 2006. And this comes from Israeli military reports. This isn't press clippings. The Hamas, the conventional part of the Hamas attack, it was modeled very closely on the tactics from 2006. Hezbollah is very powerful. They could overthrow the Lebanese state anytime they want. And if they become actively involved, Israel has a real problem. The other is in the West Bank. They've pretty much closed the borders, which is the entire economic lifeline in the West Bank. And so if a front opened there, they have a problem. And then if you throw a stone into a pond, the ripples will go outward.
And as far as we know, Iran is supporting Hezbollah, right? And in this case, we could see that Iranian parliament and authorities were cheering, and they were happy that the Hamas attacked Israel, but they could still have a huge influence in this way through Hezbollah and Hamas to cause damages for Israel.
Oh, yes.
Can Iran influence other Arabic countries, or organizations in the region?
Not directly, because remember, Iran is a Shiite state, and the deepest chasm in the Islamic world is not Arab Israel or Islam Israel. It is Sunni Shia. And so, no, directly no, but by their support of Hezbollah and Hamas. Israel, after 1967, took a lot from a lot. They grew 3 times. And they took a big piece of Jordan, which is especially Jerusalem and all of the West Bank. They took a piece from Egypt, of which they gave back a little. And they grew and grew. And there is no love for Israel in the region, none.
And how do you see Turkey's role as a regional power in this question?
I'm not sure that they have one at this point. They're seeking one. But they really are on the sidelines. They're geographically distant. They've got their own problems, to put it mildly. And that's with Iraq and with the Kurds. So as much as they'd love to go back to the period when all decisions came from Turkey, including here in Hungary, those days are gone. They'll never be back.
And as final question, I would also point on the issue that how could we, or humanity, the international community, and Israelis and Palestinians, whenever, solve this question?
The generation before mine, and I'm not young, but the generation before mine were asking that same question. The book that I wrote, The Birth Pangs of Gush Emanim, actually follow this evolution. And it goes back to the 19th century. So it is an old question. And nobody's come up with an answer yet. So I wish I had one. The Nobel Prize would be mine. But I don't. Neither side shows restraint. And on the Israeli side, they have severe internal issues. So you have a parliament that never has a majority of one party. Never. And so the extreme parties and the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, are in many ways the kingmakers. The extreme parties are very much tied to the settlement movement, what used to be Gush Emanim, and is now much more diverse. Their interest is in Eretz Israel, in Hebrew, the whole land of Israel. And by that they mean the biblical patrimony. So giving back a centimeter of land, in their view, is returning a centimeter away from Jewish redemption. You can't compromise the Word of God. And that's always the problem in the Middle East. You can compromise politics. You can compromise between parties. But you cannot compromise the Word of God. And when you say that I am acting for God, I am speaking for God, and I understand sacred text in a way nobody else does, Ishad in Arabic, but the Jewish extremists have the same thing, then compromise is impossible. And I wish I could leave us with a more positive view, but it simply hasn't happened, not since the 19th century, certainly not since 1948. The Nakba, in Arabic, which is the catastrophe, which was the birth of the Israeli War of Independence, and the Naksa, which is the big problem, which was after 1967. So the idea of going back and compromising would question the state of Israel itself. Is part of that compromise the descendants of those who left in 48 to return to their homes? No. Is Israel going to say, okay, let's have a multi-confessional state and not a Jewish state? No. And so there's very little room for compromise.
Hopefully this conflict will resolve somehow in the future, even if the long-term conflict doesn't end. Thank you very much for sharing your ideas and thoughts on this topic and for being here, Professor. Hope we will continue in a next time.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this MCC GeoPod episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinec.hu/en.